Josiah Miller, Mixed Company, read by the author Larry Hatch. Teva's Debate. Quite by fate, I suppose, Teva Mueller was now a general in the U.S. Army, and assigned to some of the regions where the new CSA had camped out and taken one abandoned fort. He always put stock in good intelligence, and the more of it the better, often hiring 3 or 4 scouts to research a particular thing, and in private comparing each set of truth and perception. He had learned some of the wily ways from me, no doubt, and I yet from Trapper Lee. It was soon that all his men, I am told, reported that the new CSA was funded by current and former people from the Great South, but in particular supplied heavily by various Miller organizations. I'm sure that pained him, for his duty now called on him to fight my people, and inevitably me, his old and once dearest friend, the man who saved him. Knowing his firm but gentle way, he would try to give me routes of escape first, and only later lay down some lead. I hope I was right on that. It was that one day at Sagewood I received a large scroll sort of thing with red wax, and half expected it to be some nobleman in New Orleans or Boston writing me. It was a sincere and heartfelt letter from General Mueller, imploring me to stop my aiding of his enemies and putting him in a situation, as we both can describe. If we did relent, no harm would come to my men, them receiving something of immunity for past offenses, and so many vague words that, well, you know how the military are. But Brundle, by this time, had paid me over $500,000 for the CSA, and at a rate adding a fifth to that each coming year to ramp things up. I had 80 new people in my employ to serve his needs, and they could also be used for other projects that made me money, him in effect paying all their salary and upkeep, so that profit was free. What would not having the U.S. Army on my tail, but on old Zach, be worth? Every businessman has his price, and I did my loss versus profit computations online and squared off paper. A thing I had learned from a wise business book imported from New York. I felt the odds heavily went with the CSA on this one. I could battle Teva's men, and not him as a body. I could at least put them off for some time, while the money flowed in. And so I would, and gave orders that no officer of the U.S. Army be killed, captured only, without my express permission to do otherwise. Well, that was different. I kept it at an officer level, for I did not want any mistakes with my old friend's life. I sent the letter back to the Blue General with one sentence: I must humbly decline, and signed my name in a blood-like shade of dark red ink, purposely allowing it to drip down the paper and dry before sealing it with the Miller's skull and crossbones wax seal. That would trouble him, for my state of mind and the visual labors were never so harsh when we rode together. Such a sign and such colors were not the Miller he knew. I sent Brundle and my own nearby units on alert. I set them on alert with this very specific news, and asked Brundle, too, to spare my young and perhaps former friend. He made no promises, but I thought he was so much in debt they might at least be willing to take prisoners only. After all, the Army was paying ransom in those years for officers taken and set free. We would find it very much a live blue general, hard to kill, as much as no one ever tosses a wagon of gold bullion into a windy canyon to be blown away. We knew fully and well of Tiva's forces, and I had extra scouts to keep track of them. His scouts kept track of us, to be sure, and oddly they never ran into each other as far as we know. But then again, both of our scouts would be well disguised as farmers, travelers, merchants, barbers even. His men had to get their hair cut. I knew that. And so I had a barber on my employ. So when the fort doors of Fort Peterson opened early one morning, we were not the least surprised, and very much the ready. But in the intervening years we had improved our Gatlings to shoot a full 300 yards further than the original specifications, and surely above what the army officer would consider being in range. We had also perfected the art of camouflage, using local materials that seemed very natural. We had enough canvas sections glued with sand and rock of various varieties in many colors to suit many lands and many areas, and these were used to shield the men and the large guns. One fellow even suggested we glue a dead catamount to the top of the stack to look even more natural, but the fool did not think that would invite gunfire. As Tiva's men rode out, him not among them, the hills came alive with a distant crackle and the whack, 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 whack of the Gatling guns. And one good cannon aimed in front of the lead man. No cavalry would proceed when a cannon went off just in front of them. Now my men, being of the same training, knew exactly what positions the blue would take as a matter of doctrine. They would back up by at most a few paces and then cover their mounts and their flanks using the available rocks and trunks. Thus the Gatlings were positioned in full advantage to sever limb from body, man from horse, horse limb from horse limb, and even from shoulders in due order. Once lowered in strength, our own cavalry rode out to mop up the survivors and end the misery of the bleeding. I did not want any cruelty on my record, at least not in this case. That would enrage the general and the others in Washington. There is a degree of cruelty a man cannot breach, even in war. There's a limit, there's a line. I by now knew the lines. Wagons came out to scoop up all the uniforms, boots, and guns, insignia, belts, and such. We would have use for them again. If old Zack had put use to 50 or more sets of blue equipment, if he couldn't, he'd be quite the fool. He was of course not, and soon informed the CSA Blues had done terrible things in the name of the U.S. Army and got to places closely they otherwise might not. My return to Sagewood, after watching the slaughter myself from a safe distance, laughing with a whiskey in hand all the while, I soon received another letter from Tiva. This time he detailed the forces of 5 generals and his acquaintance, who were now ordered to ride full into Sagewood and leave it on fire, burnt everything, quote, board for board, beast to beast, and man to man, except on order thy family, unquote. To the ground, burn to the ground everything. And all the men resisting with it. He was quite poetic this time. We had no option to fight more than 3 generals, and he surely knew it. That was pretty much my limit in those days. My advisors and I felt unlikely the army could in fact spare more than 2 generals in their forces, so it was somewhat of a bluff, inflated by 2 or 3 commands at least. But I had seen 4 forces ride out on an Apache formation of many camps, killing thousands. If it was such a threat, they could go at 4 or 5 and ruin the rest of my days. We brought back 120 men from outposts in the area to form a ring around Sagewood, including the nearly impenetrable mountains to the south. Tiva would try to use his special climbing forces to advantage there. I was certain of it. In fact, we were sure he would try to blow asunder our powder and gun buildings first, as that was Army doctrine. We mislabeled those buildings as Women's Social Club and the Brace Miller School, so scouts would too be sure of the locations, and in fact all the explosive stuff was underground in fortifications covered in dirt, rock, and sand. We marched children daily into the Miller School and women into the social club, so it would be believable. We marched them out soon again, but we knew when the scouts were there. We had a small force of gunmen and one Gatling in a nearby barn facing the powder depot at all times, careful never to ignite the powder with our firings. Even if his mountain climbers with their nifty nimble ropes, metal hooks, and winches and the like came down and in, they were no match for Gatling fire, day or night. We had torches pre-positioned on the hills in case we needed to light them up as they came down. I had my agent send a package marked top secret and sealed in U.S. Army type wax to Tiva. I was certain he would get it because it was wrapped in the type of folded buckskin they used at the time. And we had the right stamp for top secret and the right lettering and wax and all. It contained 31 photographic prints of things I had done to people who crossed me, including U.S. Army insignia with bloody parts of all the raw and very personal descriptions. And there were images of very personal things, torn asunder and ripped, cut off. It was the most horrid, stomach-churning exhibition of photos ever put into one portable gallery. I soon received a third letter saying Tiva wished to see me himself in person, and I returned an invitation assuring his safety and secure passage home. He arrived one morning unarmed and with just one aide, also having no visible weapons. But if I knew the U.S. cavalry, this man had several small pistols taped to his body, or in his boot, or in his hat. Tiva likely the same. Both were searched, and neither actually carried anything, so much as a small knife or bullet. I heard of them searched twice. Quite surprising, really. Quite surprising. My dear friend, and you still are, General Mueller said with containment of emotion, his uniform so dark and flashing metals and gold everywhere. We must not end our friendship and our men's lives this way. I have my duty and you yours, he continued. And you, my friend, know where I can go, and I know where you can go. What lines we cannot cross. I paused and said, and yet I have pledged myself to General Brundle and the Greycoats. And even we criminals are men of our words. Very solid bonds, at times. I said with a little smirk, wearing my red paisley smoking jacket and carrying a tall brandy. I was not the Miller he had known, either in demeanor or appearance, or enjoyment of evil, I suppose. My words just dripped it. Brundle is dead, and his seconds too. Tiva blurted out, raising his hand in the sign of hanging. I watched him raise it and saw no deception in his eyes. What? Brian, check on this immediately, I said to my aide, who was monitoring our communication lines. It is true, as sure as I stand in your glorious blue room, Miller, the Grand General said to his former mentor, and also looking at my man, Brian, having much exceeded him in the eyes of the general citizenry. By chance, a courier arrived at Sagewood Manor House with the same news I had sent Brian out by horse to get from our nearby communications post. Brundle and many more around him were dead, 2 forts retaken by the Blues. They'd blown them all nearly to bits, the forts and the men. Probably would have been the only way. Yes, you were more than true with the truth, my dear Tiba. Much more truthful than you said. 2 forts were taken back, 200 Greys dead, property in all seas, the rest in disarray. I looked down and my sadness was evident. Then you have a way out, Miller, the blue and gold man proclaimed. The man and men that you pledged to aid are no longer above their final home in hell. A hell that is not gray, but orange and flashing red. And he emphasized the last word with a depth of cruelty I had not seen in him before. Flashing red, yes. Yes, I knew what he meant. I relented and wrote out a paper signed in black ink to pledge to the U.S. Army I would cease and desist in aiding the CSA, remove my men from the lands around their camps, and as humanly possible turn over to the United States Army all supplies, armaments, food, clothing, material aid designed for the support of the CSA forces. We did. We went one step further and showed Tiba the supply unit outside Sagewood, and allowed his men to come in and supervise the burning of the gray uniforms and such. They appropriated the good items that might be rebadged and reappropriated in blue and gold and yellow. I will only take half of these guns as penalty. Your men could reasonably and honorably need the rest, or so my report will state, he said with somewhat disguised falsity, knowing full well not one of the guns would be used for anything much noble and legal. Good always compromises with bad for a mutual end. It must. Evil is so strong. Good always has to compromise. Despite what fairy tales and novels of our time tell you. And so it was, and we remained friends of a different sort for a time. The unlikely Englishman. It was no odd thing for a man in this country to admire the British Empire. All they had done, good and bad, and the society as a whole. The structure of it, the wealth of it, the means of it, the organization of it, the traditions, the pomp, the royalty, the way they did and said things, the way they made things, the way they invented things, the way they put everything down in books. They had given us a fine language for one thing, a serviceable one, a system of laws, book learning, ways of military dealings, styles of art, tea, fine furnishings, grand architecture, manners, so much else to be admired. Their imports sustain many lands and give us a standard for the finest of goods and the most comfortable of living. Yes, we do admire them. One of the local tribes of Apache near Sagewood was now led by a warrior who had succeeded his father, Chief Golden Bear. His name was White River, and he was more apt to tolerate the white man than his father. The newer chiefs tended to be that way. I would say tolerate, but not love. Except maybe in his case. He wore a fancy U.S. Army colonel coat and a proper British stovepipe hat. It looked very odd and adorned with some feathers and beads of his own formation. He was something of a hybrid and took much grief in private for it. Quite oddly, his American military coat had several medals he'd obtained from British officers by one means or another. Didn't matter. They weren't even lined up very well. They were just scattered at random on his front. I was too smart to ask, but consulted with him from time to time. And upon our second meeting, his assistant said, "White River, like everything British, all their fine things from the great queen over the wide sea." That was a hint to me, and I took it well. I was always inclined to make peace with tribes when they proved necessary, profitable, or close on. Any of these three criteria would do. White River's village of Apache met all three. I took his assistant's word to heart and regularly sent the young chief all sorts of British finery as my gifts. It cost me but a pittance, but I figured they would do some good, as they did not include guns. First was a box of British china, which I don't think they ever ate off of, but they looked at. Silverware and some crystal and sundries such as fine smoking tobacco, Darjeeling tea, snuff, and pain powders. It was said his tent would make a British baron feel at home. It soon dawned on me that the man would love to visit our collections at Sagewood, and perhaps I'd part with a thing or two if it did not become too awkward. We wanted access to part of their land for trapping, and I'd part with something fine for tens of thousands worth of pelts. Lucia was out of town, and I also knew what things she liked very much, and what things I could lie about. The chief arrived with 4 of his men bright one morning, and I made sure that they saw the small army that always guarded Sagewood. One always has to exaggerate such things, so people don't get any odd ideas. One can brag on one's positions, but it's also necessary to show that you're well secured, and that is quite essential, even to a friend. You never know when the friend of a friend's friend will hear of the things and be sorely tempted. It's usually not the friend, it's the friend's friend's friend, and so on, that hears and does wrong. White River walked past Lucia's finest European paintings, and he asked who all the big white chiefs were. I had read the labels a time or two. We had very valuable crystal, and one of his men admirably called them singing cups, as they were filled with our finest of spirits. I laughed and handed the young man his own cut crystal goblet, choosing by intention a very sturdy one that could last his whole journey. "You keep." I pointed several times between him and the vessel. "You keep." He nodded with a grin. His man Snow Eagle particularly liked the orange liquor, but Soaring Falcon could not bear it and cringed as widely as the other Apache smiled. My butler kept a list of drink preferences, and I announced that each man in the party would have a case of whatever thing he tasted and liked the most. Well, they liked a lot the most, and they parted with one of my wagons full of such cases. White River was shocked at my gifts, and I spoke. "You take, Miller gift," as I turned my back on him. Fortunately, they had come with treasures of their own, very fine woven baskets and ornate colors, beaded buckskin jackets, which my men would gladly purchase and even sell if necessary, and hand-carved spears. Each item was heavily worked and carved, very good stuff, their best stuff. About 2 or 3 times the normal effort for daily use. We knew we needed none of their pelts, and he knew that too. White River and his men walked out of Sagewood with arms full of British or British-like treasures, some of them French and Spanish and Dutch, in fact, cases of fine beverage, and we provided that wagon and some very good horses with it. He did not always distinguish between British things and French things and the like, but, well, to him it was all British. When I visited him next, he had the Earl of Dorset's portrait hung in his teepee, and that was the point of much curiosity for his people as well as mine. I think they thought the Earl of Dorset was the President of the United States, the Great White Chief, or maybe the King of England. I do not know which. Had I told him how unimportant the man was in the scheme of things today, well, he might have come down rudely. White River was also wearing the ornate blue and gold-braided smoking jacket from London I'd given him. That actually suited him better than the military garb. He served me proper Darjeeling, although far too strong, without milk or cream or sugar, from the fine bone china. And I used the 3 creamers as drinking cups, not knowing the difference, I suppose. One of his top warriors was smoking a British-style pipe, and it seemed to feel more grand for displaying that to us white men. One of his wives, whose name was roughly translated Pleasant Squash, wore a very nice green and silver tapestry silk vest, which was much too large for her tiny form, but it distinguished her from the other women and gave her status, no doubt. We got and kept free passage to Hanging Fog and Emerald Ridge Mountains, our western names there, though they call the regions Low Clouds, Pines to the Sky, and more to the west, River with no end. Miller Fur Company took out more than 12,000 in pelts those first few years, and with the cost of those expeditions, I probably just broke even, if all be told. No, the furs were far more than the trinkets. I'd need the furs of those lands for, well, a few more years to keep White River in British finery and trinkets. I noticed he liked shiny things. Well, I could give him shiny, cheap things, keep him happy. He didn't have a really good taste in British things. Shiny was good, not shiny, not so much. So my profit would come in future years, as the shininess grew of the gifts. But I had to temper the chief's tastes, for he had erected a second teepee for all of his treasures now. Barlow revisited. 4 of my new trapper apprentices and I took to the Brackett Hills for some training in the hopes of a decent taking. I decided it was about time to visit Barlow again, but in so doing, I wore different clothes, shaved some of my beard, and had a different demeanor. I was able to change my voice from time to time, too. and I no longer had a limp. The town was a new place, but in many ways it appeared as wild and indulgent, just in a different way. There were now more brutal forces in place, and there was no coupon book to be bought. Men rode in as they had for 10 years, but soon was their surprise. By some means, the very good sheriff and his 3 capable deputies had been put in force by a set of ladies, mostly their domineering and manly wives, who insisted that whores, drink, and gambling be put away. To catch the devils in their desires, the old places of excess were left mostly intact. It's better to take fines for sin than actually eliminate the sin. I believe that is in the Holy Book somewhere. The church ladies with frilly, pretty yet somewhat modest apparel lured men from rooftop balconies as they entered town. Yes, church ladies. Heck, some of the faux whores were still virgins. Seeking prostitution was a mandatory sentence of all your goods, gun and horse, and all, by the way, forfeited, with the terms of 1 year in the local jail. Most men gave up all they had and just left when they could. They did not have such massive facilities, so they used a ranch outside town with bars on the bunkhouses to such an end. Drinking anything stronger than a weak local thing of 3% beer, or even asking for whiskey, was 3 months in a similar situation. You got your guns, horse, and stuff back if you worked hard enough, but many men never did come out of there. But you had to pay the bill of livery if you could, otherwise your sturdy familiar beast was lost or back money owed. And what man could pay 3 years of livery from hard labor on the rocks? The town prospered as well as you can imagine, even with these harsh penalties and moral oddities. The word eventually got out about their trap, but every day some fool sought comfort in the arms of a fake strumpet and paid dearly. My 4 men and I stumbled into this religious false morality trap, and I was, of course, the wrong person to wrong in such a way. We immediately demanded luxury accommodations with 8 whores. I always used the 2 per man rule. Rich food delivered thrice a day, 20 bottles of the finest hooch on offer, fresh water, baths, a wench to bathe us, and a bought privacy that seemed to be available as before. It was all a very elaborate trap, and for the sin of our extreme nature, as they defined it, we were the devil's finest taking for the entire year. It seemed the ladies of the town and their subdominant men had forgotten one thing: actual written-up law. The rules were never published nor put on a sign. I had friends everywhere up and down the entire territory. So by a secret paid word, I summoned in 3 U.S. Marshals who worked, like me, at the edge of the actual federal law, and 2 judges, real judges. Well, 1 real and 1 former, who acted up a good storm. I called in Miller too, and 40 men to support them if things got to hanging or some other bad end. I ordered my bounty hunters to make up false documents, which the marshals might act if it came to that. And so my men and I were freed. I had the situation signed, sealed, wired, and delivered in soft wool, with lots of room for failure. I should have kept Barlow as my own kingdom, and well, could have, but it was too small and way far out to be profitable or interesting. all good things. The town of Sagewood prospers, just as our fur, casino, rangers, distillery, orchard, farms, mines, and other operations become profitable. All of those things in capitals. Yet it was not a town open to regular men in random wagon trains. We had made sure years ago that only the Sagewood Casino, with its 5 rooms for gambling, one very large and grand and full of gold, 2 separately run brothels, a hotel of more than 100 rooms, and 3 saloons were accessible by a wide road to regular folks. You had to be a Miller employee to indulge in the town itself. The gate was guarded that way. That said, we were no fools and knew that folks leaving the casino with even $1 left would need some supplies to get back to their intended journey. So there was a very massive general store on the way out of the casino, and it was stocked with everything a cowboy or gunslinger or wagon train or preacher or vacationing clan or child hungry for candy, or even Indians on a rest break might want. The store benefited from the diverse success of the town, and one could have the finest and fresh produce, locally milled flour and grain with no weevils or rats, some of the best of our strong beverages, suitable fee of course, fur garments made locally, and even things forced and fabricated like traps and agricultural plows and horse riggings. Folks came from far and wide to get our plows. They were the best. And the traps too. I did sell traps for I never thought any man had the right to all the fur trade, but I was close to that mark in some locales. There are a lot of bad traps out there. I wanted to make sure we sold only the finest that we could make and know about. Trepperley had wisely said, as always, what you ask for and what you pay for, you'll get more of the same. I wanted money, and so the casino was structured with its 5 gambling halls to accommodate the feller with just a couple of bucks in one pocket, those with average earnings, and 3 others, and a very fancy fifth one, full of antiques and furniture worthy of a manor house for the high rollers. This is not to say the middling houses were bare, more common. They were decorated fancier than the men deserved, no doubt. Just to get through the real gold bars of the Grand Palace room, you had to pay $1,000 worth of chips at the gate. It is done today, but perhaps not as well. I think we might have done it first. We gave away free liquor and women upstairs, tobacco, fancy meals, all manner of perks to anyone in the Grand Palace who qualified. My manager truthfully said, a man drunk with his belly full, his balls empty, and his pipe ready will gamble all day. That was just the kind of happy feller we all needed, and that kept me staying very rich. We were liberal in our dealings with the Indian or black man or Mexican who just happened to have 1,000 real dollars or pesos on them. Yes, we would convert things for them. We wouldn't take that Confederate or phony stuff. But if a man qualified for admittance to the Grand Palace, well, we had no prejudice. His money was good. All money is good. He might want to sit with his own kind, because nobody can force other men to be friendly or eliminate their prejudices since youth. In fact, we had several rich land barons come up from Mexico to play here, and several men of dark skin who owned goodly mine claims. They were looked down upon, but their money was good. In this regard, we did not care about a man's color as long as he presented the color green and the color gold. For reasons of convenience and that fact, is that most in our employ were not too unruly by reason of law and goodly compensation. The Miller prison was built adjacent to the casino in the same fortress that did not bear its name. A man who tried to shoot up or fight in any part of the casino, even the poor lower room, was immediately given 3 days to cool down. Anyone trying to play or pass bad money got a week. Each man had his own cell, and that was by my direct order. How many times had I or my associates learned something ripe from a cellmate, or helped the other escape, or teach us some new foul art? I would have none of that. Nay, we would have none of that at all. It would be just the man himself with his brain to torture him. Thoughts perhaps of his sweetheart or his God, and nothing else but 2 respectable meals a day. The cells were made of the same gray dark stone as the main fortress, and just 4 feet wide and 10 long. A big feller might have to be dragged in or out by a rope. And in this narrow shaft of hard stone they would have time to ponder, with only the smallest of windows, and none of those could even pass a child through. They tended to be 15 feet in the air and well above climbing range. The doors were solid steel with a short, narrow passage for plates of food. They did not want them suffering except for mind and conscience. So water was as clean as any in the town, and the food also clean, never fetid stew, with some degree of reasonable nutrition, I suppose. I'm not sure how well it smelled, but it would not kill you. "This bit better than our trail fodder," said one drover. He got too handy with his pistol, and a drover and a rival gang. It did not escape us that the man, broke and starving, might do well with a 3-day sentence and 6 decent meals that came with it. We had some regulars of this type, and as long as their money stayed in the camp, it was a fair trade. They almost came to think of it as a hotel, but since that amused me, I couldn't be more cruel. Couldn't change things. The prison had a system of redemption or reward. You don't act up, make noise, spit, throw your shit, piss on the floor instead of the pot, or sass a guard, you got a day or 2 off your sentence, if it was a long enough one. Those on the longer tomb who were, quote, model prisoners, as they say up at Leavenworth, got fresh fruit on their platter, and yes, even a small flask of whiskey if they had some injury or pain. I would have no unnecessary death on my hands, so all the prisoners were seen initially by a doctor, and any time they moaned too much or complained, and also upon leaving. Now, they didn't get whiskey for moaning. That would have been a bad cycle, but we had some liability being a private prison and all, and the bottom-feeding, scum-sucking lawyers told me so. The doc had to always sign off on their health. You never know when some rich kid, dressed as a bum or a drover, could execute on us. The doctor had an operating theater in the place, where I made sure a man with a bullet or broken bone had just the right treatment to send him on his way with some hopes of a decent life, or just life itself. Indeed, some of our employees had come from our prison, and on account of our humane treatment, wished to work for us. I had been a prisoner 30 times myself elsewhere, and knew what worked, what kindnesses matter, and what stiff rules worked. Bars and rock were stiff rules enough for most wandering souls. No use piling on to anger. There were only 2 men out of hundreds in my day who returned to prison for vengeance, and I think only 8 or 9 who ever died. Most of them came to the massive iron gates, 2/3 to the pearlies anyway. You may ask, why did we not require men to surrender their guns as they entered the casinos, as many did, and some do of it now? To me, a man without his gun is apt to be wary, angry, and on edge. As a man without a horse or severed from his Johnson. We wanted calm, happy, relaxed men. They always gamble, whore, and drink more, and were leisurely content if secure and armed. Besides, keeping track of 200 gun belts on a Friday night was more than the work of several men I did not want to pay. I made regular appearances to the gaming rooms when I was at the manor house. It was good for business. I was by now something of a legend and celebrity, and for fun would always wear my stereotypical long multi-species coat with silver pistols inside and a hat so massive and hairy I looked the fool part. This I did even in the heat of summer. It was such an effective act, though I did dress this way in the wild at times, that one of our new table bosses tried to throw me out for not knowing my face. Some ladies like to rub my silver guns for luck, but I would always turn quickly to the right, so the rubbing was better. In celebration of my birthday, though it was actually Lucia's real date, we had festivities in the casino and in town. More than 500 pies and many cakes were baked in what today was called a large industrial or institutional kitchen of our own. We built that oven from stone and steel from scratch. I tried to get my men off the feeding trough and into their own abodes with their own kitchens too. But at one time we still had hundreds needing company grub. The Miller's Day celebration, and that in literal terms did include my wife. There were always a clean out of the finest fruits, along with the pies, cakes, candies of all kinds, and a grade of liquor that was higher and yet of no charge. Most men at casino in town could never afford our sagewood gold or stuff imported from Europe. That day they could. And being a businessman, I observed that the men tended to upgrade their personal budget for whiskey or brandy after having tasted free of the much better stuff. Once a man's tongue has sampled the best, he will never be happy with lesser things.